is Emma. I am a service learner with the Monterey County Free Libraries through Cal State Monterey Bay. And today I'm going to be giving you a book review on Train Go Sorry, Insight into a Deaf World. This book by Leah Cohen is about the deaf community, being an observer and also being somewhat part of it. It's shown from both the deaf and the hearing perspectives. I'll go ahead and start off with reading off the back. In American Sign Language, Train Go Sorry means missing the boat. Leah Hager Cohen uses the phrase as shorthand for the myriad missed connections between the deaf and the hearing. Yet in the stunning work of journalism and memoir, she also forges new connections. For as she ushers readers into New York's Lexington School for the Deaf, Cohen, whose grandfather was deaf and whose father was the school's superintendent, conveys the intimate truths of this silent but immensely articulate world. Her father is a child of deaf adults, so he is a coda. He's hearing. Both of his parents were deaf, so the author's grandparents were deaf. She also follows the debates that rage within. Should deaf children be taught ASL even if that estranges them from their hearing families? Will mainstreaming deaf pupils into ordinary public schools end up stripping them of their identities? Do these attempts to cure deafness through new medical technologies make deaf people's lives better or worse? Passionately, Train Go Sorry compels us to see the deaf as they see themselves, not as victims of a pathology, but as members of a vital and nurturing culture. So, the author herself grew up at the Lexington School for the Deaf, the school her father was superintendent of, and it offers multiple and very interesting perspectives from herself with grandparents that are deaf and a father who's hearing, Russian immigrants, of a girl who's part of the Jewish community, having immigrated from Russia, and also that of a low-income Black student, and the perspective of her grandparents, which all these different sides really are very interesting, coming from, especially when it examines, the older world of her grandparents and the newer community that she lives, part of, but not in the deaf community. And, those that are actually part of the modern day deaf community. It starts out with telling the story, her background living there at the school. She felt a part of the deaf community because she grew up at the school, which is part of the deaf community. But she never learned ASL until she actually had moved out of that school and with both of her parents once her father was done being superintendent, and she actually went to college. She joined a deaf school and joined the theater department to learn ASL, which I thought was very interesting, because I thought she would have learned ASL at a younger age, but she didn't. But she always found the language to be extremely beautiful and entrancing, how communicative it was and how expressive. And then it jumps into the perspective of a Russian immigrant girl whose name is Sophia. She immigrates from Russia after leaving the Leningrad School for the Deaf, where she learned to speak Russian, read Russian, lip read Russian, and sign in Russian Sign Language. And when she came to America with her parents who are hearing and her deaf little sister, she learned English at the school. She learned American Sign Language on her own. She learned spoken English at the school, read English at the school. She learned a lip read. So she's a communicator for her sister to her parents because they didn't know ASL, and she kind of somewhat vouches for the other students that can't speak English because they just aren't good at lip reading, and they aren't good at being able to speak oral English. She's kind of caught between the world of, knowing who her family is, her family from Russia, who she immigrated with, and the deaf community who've become part of her family because they understand her struggles that she goes through. A third perspective is a low-income student who is deaf and part of the Black community. He comes from a family that cannot provide. He struggles in school. He's late to class. But that's just the way the world, was in the 70s, 80s, up through 90s, in that part of New York. And still somewhat is. That deaf school, unfortunately, is no longer there. But he one day is approached by her father to move into the school, which the school offers housing on campus, which is really cool, and food and shelter and clothing. So he moves there and his grades improve and he ends up graduating. But beyond that, who knows? Then a fourth perspective is her grandparents, who immigrated from Russia, and because they had to come through Ellis Island. Well, they didn't immigrate from Russia, they immigrated from Europe. They come through Ellis Island, and at the time, if you were deaf and you're immigrating through Ellis Island, you were not allowed admittance because you were seen to be unhealthy. So they managed to get by through immigration, especially when he was a little boy. He managed to get by without having to take any of the tests. And it's really interesting getting to hear the struggles of trying to find work. The hearing world wants you to be a very productive and self-sufficient individual, but when there aren't opportunities for someone in the deaf community, it really is very hard. He has a hard time finding jobs, but he's an extremely hard worker, and he also enjoys playing sports in his free time. And her grandmother is just really loving, caring intellectual who came from a horrible, horrible background, where her grandmother's mother was admitted into an insane asylum and then committed suicide. And then her great-grandfather, married another woman, and the chain goes on. Her grandmother's family were hearing, and she was, deaf, but she managed to raise her own family. That's really beautiful. But the book overall just really brings up the debate on the importance of bringing equal opportunity, allowing the deaf community to, have its cultural identity, which it does. And the debate of the book, the main debate, is that, at the time, schools were forcing deaf people to learn English spoken and lip reading, and it kind of deprived them of, being more involved in the deaf community through ASL, which is vital in communication amongst deaf people, where if they don't learn it, they're pretty isolated. ASL is a very physical, person-to-person language. It's hard to, nowadays, it'd be hard to do video like we did during the pandemic. So it really invokes the thought of how are people coping with that now when the pandemic happened? But it's extremely insightful, and just all the perspectives are touching, and there are some parts that do make you cry because, it really opens your mind to things you wouldn't think about normally in the deaf community, like you know, reading grammar and English grammar and ASL grammar are totally different. So reading is a struggle. And because, you know, English requires, you know, hearing the grammar, not just reading it, but hearing it so you can understand what the grammar should sound like. But yes, it is a very great book. I plan on passing this down to my family and my friends because it's a really big eye-opener into a community that you normally don't think about day to day, because there is a very small percentage of deaf in the world, but it is extremely insightful. Thank you so much for watching this video.